The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone, thank you for joining us today. We are with the student affiliates of Division 17. Student Affiliates of 17 is a national membership organization for students associated with the Society of Counseling Psychology, Division 17 of the American Psychological Association. Student Affiliates 17 membership is open to graduate and undergraduate students in counseling psychology and related fields. There are many ways to get involved with Student Affiliates of 17, so we encourage you to visit our website to learn more. We're going to go ahead and start our presentation on self-care among graduate students in counseling psychology. My name is Craig Deegan. I am one of the co-chairs for Student Affiliates of 17's Prevention and Promotion Committee. My interest is in health psychology broadly, and then also the promotion of mental and physical wellness. The ways that I take care of myself personally are spending time with friends and family members, and then also working on home improvement projects when I have time.
And I'm Corey Hess. I am the other co-chair of the SAS Prevention and Promotion Pillar. I am a fourth-year doctoral candidate at Ball State University. And as far as my research and clinical interests, I'm interested in working with kids and adolescents. And I'm interested in mental illness, stigma, and also suicide prevention. For my personal self-care, I really enjoy spending time in nature. I like kayaking and hiking with my husband and my son. And so, as we mentioned, Craig and I are the co-chairs of the Prevention and Promotion Pillar, and a really important part of promoting positive mental health is self-care. And this is something that we're really passionate about. And so when we became the current SAS host institution, Craig and I decided we really wanted to focus on encouraging and supporting students in engaging in self-care. And that was one of the goals that we set out to accomplish during our time as the host institution. So we are really excited today. We have the pleasure of being joined by 3 graduate students who are equally passionate about self-care. And they are going to share with you today some of their work related to both research and practice on this topic. And so we will just briefly introduce you to all of our presenters today before we begin our formal discussion. And we're actually going to let each of the presenters tell you a little bit about themselves before they begin their presentations. But just to give you an overview now, we have with us Rachel Turk, and she is at Radford University. We have Anil Lawani, who is at Cleveland State. And we have Yamini Belair, who is also from Ball State University. And we'll go ahead and start with Rachel, and she'll tell you a little bit about herself and the topic she will be discussing today.
Hi, I'm Rachel. I'm a third-year doctoral candidate at Radford University. Clinically, my interests are working with survivors of trauma, child and adolescent issues, eating concerns, and sports psychology. I also research-wise enjoy looking into cumulative trauma and self-care. Personally, for self-care, I like to partake in all sorts of exercise, but mostly playing volleyball as much as I can. I spend a lot of time with my friends and family whenever possible, and checking in with my cohort members or other individuals in our program and our peer mentoring group for talking about just what's going on in life. So my topic today is, do we practice what we preach? And we were looking at an emphasis of self-care in APA-accredited doctoral counseling psychology doctoral programs. So this was a project that began in my first year and was a collaborative project with 2 of my cohort members and under the guidance of one of our supervisors. So just a quick overview. We're going to briefly talk about the literature, though I'm sure a lot of you are very aware of it because we are graduate students in counseling psychology, but talking about stress in graduate students, self-care in graduate students, and then self-care in counseling professionals in general. And then go into our current study, the preliminary results, the implications, and then what recommendations we may have. Next. So again, as you all may know very well, graduate school is often associated with higher levels of stress than undergraduate school and then other areas of life. Part of this is due to an inability to control the stressors that we all have going on in our lives. And these are things that can be such as financial constraints, anxiety, academic responsibilities, clinical training, competition, interpersonal professional relationships, and then work-school life balance. Next. So specifically for graduate psychology students, there is stressors that we found when looking at the literature that are very specific. So developing skills and knowledge to providing competent services. We often place a lot of stress on ourselves to be able to provide these competent services as we're learning how. Also, the two most notable sources of stress in college graduate psychology students are financial limitations, sometimes due to having to move or even just the financial responsibilities of tuition and living, and then time constraints. And as you all know, we are very busy, and sometimes these stressors can act as barriers to our coping skills. So for example, the time constraints of not having the same amount of time as you used to be able to maybe read for pleasure or spend time with friends and family, or financial limitations to not be able to afford joining a gym that you used to attend or playing in different sports that you used to be able to do. Next. Again, negative impacts of stress, it's something that we often talk to our clients about regularly. So we know that stress has a negative impact on our physical health, emotional distress. Specifically for graduate psychology students, we tend to see higher levels of anxiety and depression, or a combination of the two. Relationship struggles, clinical or practice or burnout, reduced academic performance. And something that we found very interesting when we were doing this research is that graduate psychology students tend to have higher rates of physical and mental health symptoms than the general population and the medical students, which was somewhat surprising when considering what we hear about the medical profession. So knowing that we are having these burdens and these higher rates of these symptoms was pretty shocking to us. Next. So we then looked into self-care and psychology trainees and professionals both. A lot of the literature said that doing an ongoing self-care practice and both regularly assessing for self-care is a very critical part of trainee and serving as a clinician. It's very necessary to prevent burnout, and part of what is considered in this is counselor impairment. So counselor impairment was addressed both by the American Counseling Association and by the APA as being something that needs to be addressed throughout being aware of what's going on for ourselves to prevent a potential ethical dilemma. And specifically, there was not an APA code about it, but Principle A talks about or has a quote that says, psychologists strive to be aware of the possible effects of their own physical and mental health on their ability to help those with whom they work. So we know that over 50% of practicing counseling psychologists in a preliminary survey reported depression. Even issues like that can be interfering with clinical work that we want to hope to prevent with some self-care. Next. So the current study that we did actually took place in two different phases. The first phase, we randomly selected 24 out of the 69 APA accredited counseling psychology doctoral programs. And we were analyzing websites, we were analyzing their handbooks when we could get them, and we emailed the training directors for any informal policies or any formal policies that they did not have published. Phase two, we decided to go ahead and include the other 45 APA accredited counseling psychology doctoral programs to get a better idea of overall if this is what's going on with everybody. Next. So the preliminary results that we found that 75% of program websites or handbooks didn't mention self-care at all, and that 72% of them did not give specific self-care recommendations. So obviously these are pretty high numbers to not have any mention of it or not give any ideas about what could be done for self-care. 17% of program websites or handbooks specifically cited counseling options. So either having alternative options to their own university counseling center or mention the counseling center, although all programs did indicate that there was a university counseling center available on campus. We found it very interesting that out of all of the programs we looked at, only one addressed a potential conflict for practicum students. So whether you be a former practicum student or possibly a future practicum student, and not being able to then complete or go to any sort of counseling at that site. When we contacted the training directors, 18% of training directors stated that there was a written policy somewhere, that it just was not published. And then 55% of training directors stated that self-care is addressed in courses. So that meant they told us that they were talking about them through ethics courses, or they were talking about them through practicum courses and regularly having discussions, but that nothing formal had ever been written, and they didn't have any policies or procedures about it. One interesting thing we found when we were speaking with training directors is one training director specifically discussed the ethical implications of self-care and promoting self-care, and how not promoting self-care within the program could be an ethical dilemma because of the negative impact it may have on someone's clients, and referring back to that original APA ethics code I discussed. Next. So the implications of this, mostly, as you all probably know and what I've said today, is that there are very high levels of stress that graduate students are experiencing. Specifically, psychology graduate students are experiencing because of the extra balance between the things that were already mentioned, plus research, clinical practice, and academic work. The literature is telling us that we need proper self-assessment and implementation of self-care. But yet the vast majority of the programs don't have any formal self-care policy, that they maybe even only 50% of them are talking about them informally. So, I mean, long story short, something is not adding up here. Next. The other thing that we tended to focus on, because we were looking into counseling psychology core values, is that we do have a core value of prevention rather than remediation. Yet we're not even preventing at our most basic level. So within our own system, at our training levels, we aren't doing any sort of prevention, or we aren't doing enough sort of prevention for our counseling psychology graduate students. So long story short, we are not practicing what we preach. That's why we came up with a couple recommendations for you. First, we said that we believe that some sort of written self-care policy for all APA accredited counseling psychology programs was necessary. It may be something very simple, or it may be something with a little bit more detail, but something needs to be put in place for the programs. The policy should be emphasized by the program and supported through supervision and practicum classes. So this is one thing that we did hear some programs are doing right now. They are having discussions within practicum courses about how people are taking care of themselves, how the stress is weighing on them, but maybe having it implemented and emphasized more regularly would be helpful. And then counseling options should be made available to all students, with attention paid to possible conflicts at future or former practicum sites. And actually, our next recommendation on the next page goes with this one as well. So the fact that when conflicts occur, there should be something already set in place to assist the program for arranging comparable alternatives. Some of the literature that we looked at also said that when it's not in place and students had to then go to somebody in their program and ask for an alternative, they were more likely not to seek services, because, again, even though we all are trying to reduce stigma, there is stigma associated with it, and knowing these people of authority over you, knowing that you may be interested in counseling services. So that something should be set up by these program directors or faculty to have different options for students who have served as a practicum student or will serve as a practicum student in their counseling center. Next, programs should possibly consider implementing some sort of stress relief or coping skills workshop into the curriculum. This could be something like a brown bag lunch, or it could be a weekly or monthly gathering between students, or it could be a one program or 1 credit hour program that students do throughout their time in their program. The last thing that we personally implemented at Radford was a peer mentoring program. Some of the literature we looked at, again, mentioned the support that you can gain from some social interaction with those around you, especially those who also know of the difficulties that you are experiencing. So it may help new students to acclimate to the program, and it may give older students a sense of support from other students who aren't in the same place as them. So this may just be someone who can also share your challenge of doctoral work. So we implemented this program within our own university and are really enjoying it so far and trying to make it better, but it may be something that may be useful to others of y'all. I do think these are just a few suggestions that we came up with, but I believe our other two presenters today are going to be giving us some other approaches and recommendations that are going to be very helpful to you all. So thank you. These are just a few references.
Thank you so much, Rachel. We really appreciate your perspective and the research that you've been doing with graduate students. I would encourage everyone, if you do have questions, feel free to ask them throughout the presentations today. If you would like them to be specifically to a certain presenter, please let us know who you would like them to be directed to, or if you'd like them directed to the entire panel, please just preface that as well. I'd like to introduce Anil now, who is going to be presenting on graduate student self-care and minority stress. And I'll let him introduce himself and continue on with this presentation.
Yeah, thanks, Greg, and also thanks, Rachel, for that very useful presentation. Hi, everyone. My name is Anil. I'm a fourth-year doctoral student in the Urban Education Council at Cleveland State University. My scholarly interests are focused on promotion of preventative practices among international students, racial ethnic minorities, and LGBTQ individuals. For personal self-care, I like to get adequate sleep at night, kind of the basics, but that's also important. And I try connecting with loved ones when possible, and if weather permits, I try to go for long walks in nature. My section in this webinar is aimed at addressing self-care within the context of, and more specifically highlighting the need for self-care among counseling psychology graduate students who will be dealing with minority stress, either as a result of disenfranchised social identities of their own, or while serving individuals and groups who report minority stress. That being said, I would like to indicate that my perspective on self-care is not exclusive to what's emerging in this area. So the need for policy at a program level that Rachel just talked about, or what I believe Yamini's section that's after me will talk about, my perspective can be considered as an add-on or like an added component to those approaches. I just want to highlight the importance of also attending to minority stress in this conversation, which is about self-care. So speaking of highlighting some things, can I have the next slide, please? Thanks. So what I plan to highlight in my section, in my understanding, minority stress is not new to counseling psychology. But like I said, I plan to revisit that briefly in the context of this webinar. Similarly, I will briefly revisit self-care and attempt to establish connections between minority stress and self-care next. I will then conclude my section with sharing some thoughts on doing self-care as a minority student and a couple resources and ideas. Next. So minority stress, like I said, and maybe I'm repeating myself, it's a model that has been utilized considerably by counseling psychology scholarship. But some key relationships to draw from the model include knowing that concept of stress relates to adaptation. Also, broadly speaking, stressors can vary across context. For example, losing a job might be a bigger stressor for someone, whereas loss of a relationship might be for someone else. Stress can very well be social in nature, wherein events that cause hurt and loss to marginalized social identity groups like LGBTQ, communities of color, trans communities, and more, all of those can possibly impact them as stressors. Furthermore, an individual's interactions with organized forms of prejudice and discrimination, such as sexism and racism, can also be likely sources of stress. And just like other forms of stress, minority stress too requires adaptation and coping. Next. So next, briefly revisiting self-care. Recently, a scale was developed to assess self-care among professional psychologists. And the authors of this study define self-care as a multidimensional, multifaceted process of purposeful engagement in strategies that promote healthy functioning and enhance well-being. So key connections to draw from a minority stress standpoint, I believe, might include acknowledging that self-care involves multiple facets of one's personal and professional life. Purposeful in the sense that it involves influence of one's values and subjective intentions. Also that it is a process and it is aimed at health promotion and building wellness in all forms, not just physical, but also psychological, spiritual, and many more dimensions of health and well-being. Next. So now, quickly considering minority stress and self-care in conjunction, unfortunately, the reality remains that many graduate students with minority identities have had or will navigate minority stress in their personal and professional lives on an almost daily basis. And as counselors, psychologists, and educators in training, while working with clients and groups of interest, graduate students provide care and resource for minority stress, and they might also be dealing with vicarious social trauma as a result. And self-care has gained significant attention vis-a-vis training and professional development of applied psychologists, such as listed in the Feminist Code of Ethics. Also, practicing self-care as a professional might anyway approximate, I believe, behaviors that involve subjective values and holistic well-being. For example, some items of the professional self-care scale, which I discussed in the previous slide, some items of that scale imply subjective values like community ties. For example, there's an item that says taking part in community events, and there's another item that says fostering a sense of social connection and belonging. So, so yeah, that's that as well. Next slide, please. So at this point, what are some ways to promote a culture of self-care in one's community as a minority student? That's a question that I was kind of asking myself. And I think one way could be creating a culture of self-expression and engaging in conversations about the importance and challenges of caring for self. I believe the stigma of marginalization can be attenuated by expressing mutual regard for the challenges of having difficult dialogues and navigating social barriers in one's clinical advocacy, be it teaching, organizing, and all kinds of other important professional roles that one has as a graduate student. Another way could be to give voice and a medium to minority psychologists in training to integrate need for self-care in their roles as agents of change and social justice. Perhaps faculty initiating discussion at a program level, kind of along the lines of even implementing a policy at a program level that Rachel talked about, or at a classroom level that produces real discourse. That would be another way to go about it. I would be interested in learning more about what are some additional ways. So maybe we will hear some ideas today during the Q&A portion of this webinar. And maybe building even theory and scholarship in psychology to study self-care among minority populations. For example, I think of maybe recruiting individuals from minority backgrounds and attending to systemic influences like historical oppression in the research that we are aiming to conduct on self-care as we move forward. Next. So last but not the least, I would say, I know personally this is true for me. I can think creatively when it comes to self-care of my clients and colleagues. But I would say also allowing yourself the resources you might be offering your clients, kind of being a role model in a way for them of self-care. There are some internet-based resources also that I've listed here. Those might be helpful towards people of color vis-a-vis effects of psychological trauma. The next one is geared towards LGBTQ+ individuals. And the third and the last one is kind of generic. So it's not group specific. And at this point, I would say thank you all for attending this presentation. This is my last slide. I look forward to hearing more ideas and any questions there are. The key takeaway is that self-care is unique to everyone, but it is also for everyone. And if I can have the next slide, that's references. So here are my references. Thanks again, and over to Yamini at this point.
Thank you so much, Anil. We really appreciated your perspective and talking to us about minority stress and coping. And we will go ahead and have Yamini present on a self-care group that she helped to develop and tell us a little bit more about herself.
So hello everyone, my name is Yamini Bellare, and I am a doctoral candidate at Ball State University. Currently, I'm an intern at the University of Florida Counseling and Wellness Center. Some of my scholarly interests are in international cross-cultural research in the area of everyday stranger harassment, and also in a related, within international research, I also conduct some work on career development among youth in different countries. For self-care, I usually enjoy cooking Indian food, spending time with family and friends, and taking long walks. So today I'm going to talk about COPE, which is a self-care group for counseling psych students in training. Next. So let's start with a brief origin story, and then I'll go on, give you an overview of the group, and then some future directions that we got based on feedback that we received from our participants. COPE started as a class project for Dr. Steph Eigesdotter's class at Ball State. We decided that we got such good feedback from our classmates and peers that we need to actually conduct this group at Ball State. So our first self-care COPE group was held in fall 2016. And then this year, we had some new developments because of SAS, Division 17, the prevention pillar. They approached our team and suggested that we could convert COPE from an in-person to an online group. And so that we can invite MA and PhD students from counseling psych programs from around the country. So currently, COPE is an online group that meets on Skype on a weekly basis. Next. So this section was pretty well covered by Rachel. So briefly, there's a lot of research suggesting that counseling psych students experience a lot of stress and burnout. A lot of them experience anxiety, depression, and some even admitted to having some suicidal thoughts. And also, some other literature suggests that students do have a lot of difficulties juggling a lot of obligations, like obligations at work, home, and school. And a lot of them experience psychological distress. Next. So before we could actually start the group, we went through a very in-depth literature review. So this kind of helped us establish that, yes, counseling psychology students are stressed out, and a lot of programs do not have resources to support their graduate students. And as Rachel mentioned, a lot of graduate students also do their practicum and internship at the UCC that's on campus, which kind of prevents them from getting free services on campus. And a lot of times, if you have to go out in the community for counseling services, it can be pretty expensive. And students like us, we are already pretty financially strapped, so that becomes an additional burden. So it becomes easier to avoid seeking help in the community. Hence, we wanted to make resources like COPE available within the department so that students had somewhere to go and get some peer-based support, which we hope could reduce some stress and burnout. Next. So we also did a brief kind of needs assessment within our department here at Ball State University. So normative need are what do the standards say? So we found that within CACREP, the CACREP standards, which is for master's mental health degrees, they said that personal development is important. And they also said that graduate programs have the responsibility to support students by offering preventative services and programs that mediate stress. So from this, it was pretty evident that these different standards did at least stress some kind of self-care. The second, the perceived need, we did a short social survey of some qualitative questions asking our students to kind of give us some insight into would a program like COPE be helpful. And based on this review, we found that a lot of students mentioned that they have had some difficult personal experiences and would like some support. Others said that they have stretched themselves so thin between class requirements, assistantships, internships, that they rarely engage in self-care, which is impacting their personal and physical health. So from what feedback we got from students, it was pretty evident that something needs to be done to support our graduate students in training. Then the express need is what kind of services are on campus or in the community, and we did not find a lot of resources for graduate students that were free and available in the community. So there was a definite need there. And then finally, we found that overall, there were very few graduate students that had actually sought help in the community. So to kind of summarize our needs assessment, there was a very clear need for a self-care group. So based on our research into the literature and the needs assessment, we developed the COPE self-care group. Next. So some of the objectives of COPE were to decrease the number of stressors related to graduate school life, increase some stress reduction skills, increase social support, especially within the cohort or department, because we did get some feedback that it feels lonely in the department, especially when you're not taking classes with your cohort, or you're away on internship and you're just taking just a couple of classes. There's an element of loneliness there. And then finally, also our overarching goal was to help students reduce depressive and anxiety symptoms. Next. We used a theoretical framework by Taylor and Aspinwall, and based on this model, we found that we could intervene at 3 different levels. The first one was appraisal. So how does the student think about the stress? The second area of intervention was coping. So giving the student some coping skills and repertoire that they can use to cope with graduate student stress. And the third area of intervention was social support. So giving a group that meets regularly every week would give them an environment where they are willing to, seek support. And then finally, we were hoping that as we intervene at the appraisal, coping, and social support level, we could improve psychosocial outcomes for our students. So, which would mean reducing, stress and improving emotional and physical health outcomes. Next. So, going over the program description, the activities that we focused on mainly were psychoeducation. So we talked about stress, we talked about self-care, self-compassion, mindfulness, giving our students, our participants, some information about different aspects of self-care. The second was experiential. So we did a lot of role plays, meditation activities, something that allowed our participants to actually perform self-care within group. So if outside group, if they don't have time, they've at least done something like meditation or deep breathing for that, during that 1 hour that we met for COPE. And then finally, discussion time with peers. So we had a lot of open-ended questions, and we found that a lot of times participants just took the material and had really deep and insightful conversations about the content. The group was led by counseling, doctoral counselors in training, and we had some supervision from Dr. Steph Eigesdotter, who is a professor in our department. And through all of this, we hoped to get certain outputs. So the main aspects were helping our students learn some coping skills, practice stress reduction, and also get some information. Also foster social support and strengthen that sense of belongingness and peer support through experiential activities and discussion. And through all of this, we hoped that we could prepare our students to be more equipped to deal with stress, feel supported through social support, be prepared to handle future stresses, and together we hope that this improves academic output, helps them stay in the program, prevents burnout, helps them go ahead, get higher degrees or jobs, etc. And finally, reduces depression and anxiety. Next. So we also performed an evaluation. We had some quantitative scales like the graduate stress inventory, the Beck anxiety inventory, etc. But unfortunately, given that we had only 10 participants, the value of comparisons wasn't that great, and we had non-significant results. However, where we got the most rich results was our qualitative feedback. So our participants gave us feedback saying that COPE helped them develop peer support. What we observed was COPE was met from 5 to 6 on Thursdays, but our participants would actually meet half an hour before, have dinner together, kind of chat outside a group, and then when they came into group, they'd already bonded outside, and we would be ready to talk about the content. So they kind of created their own peer support space. They also gave us feedback that they learned new coping skills that they could actually use with their clients. And COPE also gave them an opportunity to be creative with self-care. So we kind of made it clear that self-care looks different for different people. So we invited them to be creative with the material and make the most out of what we're presenting. We also got some feedback about how COPE can be changed. The first feedback we got was the time commitment, but this was kind of tricky because we usually push self-care to the end of our to-do lists. So COPE was kind of forcing them to make some time in their busy schedules to come in and talk about self-care. So, we kind of used this feedback to turn the in-person group to an online group, hoping that that reduces that feeling of time commitment. And then we also got feedback that maybe focus less on psychoeducation and more on experiential, which we also kind of took, and we added more activities. Next. So to kind of, end my presentation, some challenges were mostly time commitment. That was our biggest issue. Is for example, our online group, we recruited a lot of people, but when the group actually started, we had a large number of people drop out, and that's because of time commitment, which is, it's a sign and a symptom that our graduate students don't really put self-care first. The second challenge we had was, so where is the boundary at between a peer support and when does it kind of get into the group therapy area? So we tried to make it more peer support pretty intentionally, but there were times where it would become a little bit like group therapy. And finally, the online group, we had some issues with cohesion because these were different students, different programs, and meeting on Skype doesn't have that quality of an in-person meeting, so that was also an issue. Some future directions, we hope that COPE actually becomes a 1 credit hour course so that the time commitment aspect doesn't become a burden. So we're hoping that our departments kind of support us, and we already have an outline for COPE. It's based on research. We've done needs assessment, so we are hoping that we can convert this into a 1 credit hour course. And also we would like to, spread COPE in other departments as well. So if any of you who are attending today would like to have COPE in as a group in your department, please reach out to us, and we would be happy to share our resources with you. So thank you for attending today's seminar, and I look forward to kind of having any questions from you guys, but thank you for the opportunity to share COPE with you guys.
Thank you so much, Yamini. We really appreciate the perspective on the group that you've started. We are going to take some time to answer questions now that we've received from our audience. And so I would ask our presenters if they're able to show their webcams, that would be great, so people know who they're speaking with. And I will go ahead and throw out some questions that we've already received. First, to all of our panelists, one of our listeners said that they often hear people ask, what do you do for self-care, rather than how are you self-caring, saying that it's usually more future-oriented than present-focused. as an activity, it's often hard to find good time to do self-care, and then it becomes kind of a burden, just like Yamini was talking about. So how do you think self-care can be different as an attitude in addition to an activity?
I can start, and I think that's a really great question because we do talk about it in that way. I've actually been fortunate to be a part of a practicum course this semester that we've talked about self-care quite a bit, and it has turned more into the attitude piece of it. And I think it's very interesting to conceptualize it that way. So the attitude is maybe much more pervasive throughout life. So what am I doing throughout my daily life that is helping reduce my stressors? And I think maybe a move towards talking about it more in that way, as opposed to the activities that we are doing, because there is a sense of guilt that is often associated with taking that time away to do something for yourself. That's something that I didn't mention in my presentation, but through a lot of conversations with students has come up repeatedly, that it is something that we feel like we are always supposed to be working and always supposed to be researching and getting things done as graduate students, and that taking just a little bit time away for ourselves maybe isn't appropriate all the time. So I think if we can think about it more in a pervasive aspect of what are we doing throughout the day, what am I doing to reduce my stress, how am I taking care of myself, and it could be the little things. It's kind of like celebrating the little successes, I would say. But I don't know about the rest of the presenters.
Yeah, that sounds really good to me. I was going to say, I would like to second what Rachel said. Self-care in a way sort of boils down to behaviors, like we're doing these things which will ensure our well-being, but it starts with like any behavior, it starts also at a cognitive level, like how you think about well-being and how you conceptualize your well-being, also as a graduate student specifically in this context. So certainly there is that attitudinal sort of component to talking about self-care and thinking about self-care in this context. Yeah.
And I feel that I really like your question about attitude versus activity, and we were hoping through a group like COPE that it starts through activities and eventually it becomes an attitude as you practice it more and more, and it comes more effortlessly as you practice it more. So that is what we were hoping would happen if we are more intentional about it.
Thank you all so much. The next question we have is, I wonder how faculty members in your programs or at your universities have responded to your interests and efforts in studying and promoting self-care among graduate students. Have you met any resistance or challenges in your efforts to do so? And if so, how have you handled that?
Maybe I can sort of take the first stab at this. Firstly, I would like to talk, this is a great question, and I would like to firstly acknowledge that it can be difficult easily looking at faculty's kind of support or sort of having this conversation with your faculty members, because then you're looking at towing the lines of power and authority, and especially at a program like the one we have at CSU, which is somewhat of a smaller counseling psychology program. You have to kind of think about other things, as you're approaching a faculty person to sort of have that conversation. But I would say, we can maybe borrow from this kind of common suggestion. I'm assuming this is kind of commonly provided to us as trainees, which is to advocate for our clients. So kind of, wear that hat ourselves and try to sort of allowing ourselves to advocate for our own needs, and kind of then more and more research emerging areas. So maybe we can utilize some of that research and then plan to sort of approach our training director maybe, or a faculty advisor, kind of make them sort of introduce them to this research and kind of advocate our self-care agenda to them. And also just one more thing in terms of how my program has dealt with it. It's very fortunate. Our training director, Dr. Julia Phillips, she actually got really interested in self-care last year, and she also thought to even conduct some research, and that's how I got into sort of this line of sort of thinking about self-care. So as a training director, she also introduced self-care as a topic for our brown bags, and that's like an annual thing. We do like brown bags every 2 or 3 weeks, and that's like a tradition in the making in our program, which is great. So yeah, so if it can come from the top level, then it makes things easy in this situation. Yeah, this is what I have to say.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I believe my advisor on the project, Dr. Nick Lee, was our first year teacher in a course who was very okay with saying, okay, you need to take some time for self-care, and if you can't get to that, that's fine. Knowing that we were all overachievers and we would all hopefully, get things done anyways, but he was very supportive of us taking some time for self-care. But I do agree that not everybody has that luxury. And that in those situations, have found it helpful to kind of find an ally, whether it be a previous student who has already graduated the program and maybe has nothing to lose at this point, or another faculty member who understands where you're at right now and is willing to advocate for you if you feel like that power differential is too much for you to be able to do it for yourself without some sort of consequences. So that would be my maybe biggest piece of advice, is if you can find an ally in this type of research or just in this type of care for yourself to do that.
And I think within Ball State University, when we had this idea of having a self-care group, we got a lot of support from our faculty members. A lot of them helped us advertise. Dr. Steph kind of stepped in to supervise. So we got a lot of support from our faculty members. And I really like your point, Rachel, of having an ally. And I felt that sometimes going beyond the department was also helpful. And I found my self-care ally at my practicum site on campus, and it helped me get a range of allies instead of just professors. So I was able to reach out to them, and they were pretty helpful in helping me be more intentional about self-care.
Thank you all. Our next question is, I wonder if you have seen any connection between self-care and self-compassion.
I have not specifically looked into that, but I would guarantee there's probably a connection for sure, because just the amount, like I had mentioned before, of oftentimes guilt that is associated with taking that time away to do some sort of self-care. So that would just be my guess, but I have not seen anything.
I think generally there's a lot of research connecting being self-compassionate to better mental health outcomes. So if we integrate self-compassion into our self-care routine, we can actually strengthen it. Because a lot of times as graduate students, self-criticism becomes a big motivator. But self-criticism can also be overwhelming. So if we're able to relate to ourselves using more self-compassion, that's also engaging in self-care. So there is a definite connection between the two concepts.
Thank you both. The next question is starts out with a lot of the stress that we experience is financial, and we cannot help but wonder how to pay off the debt. How do you deal with uncertainty in that part of being a graduate student? Not sure if any of our panelists have considered that or that uncertainty piece of self-care.
Yeah, I mean, I would say there's a lot. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I would just say there's a lot of uncertainty with graduate school in general, specifically about the financial piece. As much as I hate to say it, I think there's even a piece of like acceptance that has to come into it, or that I've had to use personally of it's going to cost some money now, but eventually, I'll be coming out with a job that I love doing, and hopefully I will be able to afford to pay that back. But I think all of the uncertainties that come with graduate school are one of those reasons that stress is so high for us.
And financial issues is always such a tough thing to face, especially for graduate students. So and a lot of graduate students tend to have issues with loans and other finances. So kind of having that peer support where I'm not alone in this, and I can get support, emotional support, if my finances are stressing me out, is kind of important. So as long as you're talking about it and getting that emotional support, I'm hoping that makes that uncertainty a little more bearable.
And I'm not sure, Anil may have tried to respond to one of our questions, but we may not be able to hear him. I don't know, Anil, if you wanted to weigh in on this. So it seems like we're having some difficulties hearing Anil. We can't hear your microphone. We can tell that you're speaking with us. And so I'd ask if you would want to, you can write up your response to that, and that might be something that we share with our group of people if they're interested. Yep, Anil, I'm sorry, we can't hear you right now. So I apologize for that, and we would love for you to, again, weigh in, or feel, if people do have other questions for Anil, to send those to us so that we can make sure to ask him. We'll do one more question here, and that is self-care a cultural product of an individualistic society, or do you believe so? And if so, how does it work for others as cultural beings?
I'd actually never thought of thought of self-care in that way, but I think it is very interesting to conceptualize it as a piece of an individualistic culture. I think in maybe a more collectivistic culture that people are maybe more responsible for the care of others as well. And so there's less pressure on one person to ensure that you are doing everything for yourself because everybody is looking out for everybody. So I think that could definitely play a role in it, but I'm not sure. I bet other people would have other opinions on that as well.
Yeah, I agree with you, Rachel. And self-care does seem, individualistic, but it would look different probably in a collectivistic society. I'm actually curious to know what Anil thinks about, this topic.
Yes, and we will try to get a response from Anil on here. Anil, if you would like to type up something and send it to me, I can read that off for the group. We appreciate everyone sticking with us during technical difficulties. Okay, Anil said his response is yes. Culture, like along the lines of attitudes and beliefs, does have a role to play in self-care. All right, thank you, Anil. We appreciate your responses, and thank you everyone for attending. One of our viewers did ask if you all as panelists would be willing to share your resources and references lists with our group if people were interested in receiving those. And so would that be okay with you all?
Sure.
And it looks like Anil would love to as well. And so if you are interested in receiving those, you are more than welcome to email us, myself, Craig Deacon, and so my email address is csdeken@bsu.edu. This webinar will be available on the Division 17 website for viewing later. And so you're more than welcome to send us questions that you have after this webinar, and we really appreciate our panelists, Rachel, Anil, and Yamini for being here today, and for all of you for coming and attending. We also thank Division 17 for hosting this webinar. And again, my name is Craig Deacon. Corey Hess and I are the Prevention and Promotion co-chairs for the student affiliates of 17, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.